Welcome to the June edition of Radical Reimaginings, the video version. I am here with my co-hosts Deven and Tiffany. If you want to learn a little bit more about who we are, you can go check us out on Twitter. But we are very excited to have our guest today. Jara Dean-Coffey is here with us and agreed to come talk to us about this month's prompt. I'm going to do a little intro of Jara because I know she does not like to talk about herself. So I'm going to tell you the top 3 things that I think you need to know about Jara. Jara is not an evaluator. That's the first thing. Jara is a strategist. Second thing is Jara says one of my very favorite things to think about as I'm doing all my work is that you have to be for something. And that is something I think about almost every day, is that like, what am I for in this thing that I'm doing? Thinking about my outcome of, why I'm showing up in it. And that's why her work has been really influential in my thinking, and I think even in the thinking of the Radical Reimagining Project. And the third thing I'd like you to know about Jara is that she really doesn't like to talk about herself. And that is why I'm doing the intro. So if you want to know more about Jara, you need to go out to her many websites and check out her work. So we'll be linking to some of those in the comments here. So welcome, Jara. Thank you for being here with us today. I guess I'll just start out by asking you, why did you think talking with us about Radical Reimaginings was worth your time?
Well, first, I am a deep believer that relationships are core to everything. And so, in transparency, Libby and I met when she joined the American Evaluation Association, and it was deep love at almost first sight. And so pretty much anything Libby asks, I will do. So I've just given Libby a tremendous amount of power in a public setting that hopefully Libby will use for good.
I use it wisely.
Yes, use that wisely. And I think it's just really important in this moment, even before the global pandemic and a realization of the structural racist underpinnings of the United States of America and really globally, that we really challenge ourselves to free ourselves to think really differently. And there's something about the word choice of imagination and radical that I think is quite liberating. And I think we just need more intentional spaces to practice what that feels like, so that we can better do it.
Yeah, I'll respond just real briefly to that. I don't think we have fully explored what radical really means yet. And I think it's something we're in the process of leaning into and learning what that really means. I have another way I like to use that as radical hospitality is what I list as one of my values. And that goes back to what you're saying about relationships, is like, I really try to be radically accepting of people that I meet and understanding their perspective. And that's one way I'm learning, but this radical reimagining is I think we're still leaning into what radical fully means. So, yeah.
I think the other thing I would add to that in the US context, radical tends to be a term that's used to challenge the status quo. And so I think there's something really powerful about 3 people that look like you and don't look like me, using the term radical and what that signals and what that invites to other folks, I think is actually really powerful. So I appreciate the word choice.
Great. Thank you. Deven?
Well, we're hopeful because we avidly follow you on Twitter that maybe we could get some hashtag JDC Truth Talk through a response to this month's prompt.
Okay.
Which is, what does it look like to go to work with your values intact?
It's a really funny question for me because I have more of a sense of what it looks like because I've seen it when people don't go to work with their values intact. Right? It tends to be pained and problematic and stressed, and there's no joy, right? And I'm surrounded by people who are constantly going to work with little joy. And I think it's because they're out of alignment. and it's really hard to be around, in all honesty. So that's one answer. I think the other answer for me, and again, I say this all the time, I have privilege, right? Part of it is I've created privilege, and part of it is I came in and my parents gave me privilege. And I take great responsibility in using that privilege to try to create spaces, wedges, room for other people so that I can get out of the way when I'm deemed no longer useful. So for me, coming to work with my values intact means that I'm fully present 100% of the time, which isn't always welcomed and probably isn't always a really good thing all of the time, but I never go to sleep thinking, wishing I had done something different. It may not have gone the way I wanted it to do, but I don't really live a life of regret or remorse or even apology, in all honesty. I'm pretty unapologetic because I try to be as true as I can be and be really honest about what I'm going to bring. And at this stage of the game, if you've invited me into your house, I like to use vampire references, then you know exactly what it is you're going to get. You can also disinvite me out of the house, just like a vampire, and I will leave and I can't come back in. But if you've invited me in, then you have seen all of my various social media threads. You've probably talked to enough people, and you should not be surprised.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful, just to be able to, putting your values out there is something that I think people rarely do. And this is almost the conversation we were having, that Deven and Tiffany and I were having before this, is that so many of us don't put our values front and center. And that, to me, what I hear you saying is like, your values are always out there. People know what they're getting when they work with you.
Yeah. And as my consulting career evolved, I got more explicit about the signaling that I wanted so that people wouldn't waste their time thinking that I was something that I wasn't. Because to me, time is that commodity we can never get back. And so I wanted to be as transparent as I could be in all of the communications, so people would come with some real sense of who I was. I think the other thing to add to that is, because I look like this, people make a lot of assumptions around the type of work that I do and the kind of way in which I will be in the work. And I like to dispel those notions really quickly. So that also just means people aren't calling me writing about, can you do diversity work? I'm like, there is absolutely no indication in all of my ridiculous number of social media presence that I do diversity work. That is not what I do, right? So I just try to get really clear so that some of the stereotypes around what a Black woman does in this work get dispelled. And I still get emails like, do you do diversity work? And I'm like, I don't know where that shows up.
Well, I think that's I think that relates to people's fundamental understanding of the difference between diversity work and equity, right?
Exactly.
And so they equate the two when they
totally do. Yeah. There's not the word diversity, I think, on any of my websites.
Yeah. But I think when people have a very shallow understanding of what equity means, when you say equitable evaluation, they think that you mean diversity.
Yep.
So,
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you mean, just for the audience? What do we mean when we say equity versus diversity? I know, but how would you define it?
So when I think of equity, so this is when my strategy hat and my evaluation hat merge. I think that equity is both how you engage in the work, and I actually think it's demonstrable by quantitative, qualitative, and other tatives that we've yet to imagine ways of measurement. It is that I could not tell who I am demographically, my life expectancy, my life journey, right? Right now, having just met Deven, we could guess Deven's ethnic or race identity and mine based on certain norms in the US. That should not be the case, right? As flawed as the data is, we can actually tell that I'm Black and Deven's not. So when I think of equity, I think of both and diversity for me is a tactic. It is about representation. It's about perspectives. It's about differences, but in no way do those things add up to actual changes in people's health and well-being.
Unless you add the equity to it, right? It's
well,
like,
you didn't have to add the equity to it. You could do I mean, we don't know. We've never done it, right? We've never focused on equity. We've focused on diversity and we've skipped over inclusion. So we actually don't even know, because this is all new territory, because this wasn't a country designed to be equitable.
Yeah, I know this wasn't one of the questions we planned to ask, but I think I want to tie this back to what we were talking about with our values, right? Showing up with our values intact. And I think a lot of people who maybe haven't really interrogated their own values would say that one of the values they hold is equity or diversity. You know, they believe in diversity,
right.
and they haven't like operationalized that, right? And so I think when we have this sort of shallow understanding of what diversity and equity is, we don't know how to actually like. Those aren't, equity isn't a value per se, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so like, can we talk a little bit about like then how, you know, if for somebody who wants, you know, who's still at this like sort of shallow understanding of what equity or diversity is, how do they operationalize that into their values and actually living that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. Yeah,
I think it's a both and, right? If you aren't seeking an end where there are no if you aren't seeking an end where there are no demonstrable differences based on demographics, right? Salary, movement, publishing, all of the monikers, salary, then you're really talking about, you're not talking about equity in my mind. You're talking about access. And I think a lot of times when we talk about equity, we're really talking about access, and we've actually tried that in this country, and that hasn't worked either. Right. Because access isn't enough. It assumes, for me, access in this country at least, tends to put the burden on the individual to access the thing, right? With no acknowledgement that the thing was never designed to be accessible, which is part of the US preoccupation with rugged individualism, which is one of the ways in which white folks pretend that they didn't get a leg up. That, as my husband would say, that you arrived on second base. You didn't even have to hit. Some folks are on third base when they come into this world. Some folks own the stadium, right?
Yeah.
Own the stadium, own the players. But there's this idea that, well, I got here on my own. And that just is part of the lie of the United States. It's actually not true.
Right. Tiffany, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think this really does tie in.
Yeah.
And you've been doing a lot of this blogging about this kind of related topic around values. So how do you think that this topic relates, or the idea of going to work with your values intact relates to that idea of playing the long game that you recently wrote about?
I'm thinking, because I hadn't thought about that. I guess it goes back to service, which I think I wrote about in that blog, right? It's like, who are you in service to and for what? And I think a lot of times values are in service of people feeling better about themselves, and how they're navigating or negotiating the world in which they've been brought into, either with or without privilege. And so the values help them feel better about that. And for me, at least, the next level of values is really about, how does whatever I have serve something greater than me? Right, so it's a weird mix between values and being valuable, but the being valuable is to be dictated by other people, not by my own sense of, great, I lived my values. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And when you wrote about the long game, I thought about a conversation that we'd had at the at the board level around cathedral thinking, right? This metaphor that these old cathedrals, Notre Dame, took 250 years to build, and that the architects of the cathedral didn't know, they would never be able to worship in the church that they were building, right? And so as we think about being in service, knowing that, true equity, won't happen in our lifetime. How do you stay motivated? How do you stay in the work and playing that long game, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you just described, is this like that you show up every day, and if you can know that you're being in service to your values and that you've interrogated your values in a way that you're very clear about those things, and you always engage in a way that you're saying, what am I for? Who am I in this? And what do we want out of it? You say it better than I just did. But I think that's what I get from that, is like, that's how you stay purposeful and in service.
And the other thing I would add is people have to tell you you're being useful. Right? So for me, at least, it's the ways in which I have showed up in 2020 are not because I particularly want to do that. It's because people have told me that it's useful for me to do that. And I hope people will tell me when it's no longer useful, and I'll go back to my blanket fort. Like, I'll be totally happy in my blanket fort.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, part of the being of service is people telling you are of service, not you claiming that you're trying to be of service, which to me always feels like the expression of values is for your own self-worth. Right? It's like when people say they're an ally. I'm like, I think other people have to say you're an ally. I don't think you get to claim that. When people say they started a movement, I'm like, I think other people have to say it's a movement. I don't think you get to claim that. I think there's some monikers that people bestow on you, and you decide whether you want to take them or not, but I don't think you get to name yourself all of these things, which we are so comfortable doing in the US.
But that's our rugged individualism,
there,
right?
There you go, exactly.
So it shows
up in lots of different ways.
Right. Yeah.
Which makes it really hard for people to go away, right?
Yeah.
They never really go away. Well, it feeds them in some really interesting way, right? It's feeding their ego in a way, as opposed to feeding the larger whole, I think.
Right. Yeah, and I think, our next step with Deven and Tiffany is for us to come up with what we're going to talk about next month. And that's an interesting piece. So we hadn't talked about this as a group, but like this idea of the collective set of values, right? And that the collective gets to name like the way we show up in service, that we don't have to decide that solely as individuals of like how we're going to go be in service. Is like we have to like be listening and be part of the collective in order to really be of service.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, especially for white people in this work right now, we often feel like we're supposed to do it alone, right? And that's a problem, right?
Right, and that's part of the rugged individualism plus the guilt, right? So it's the combination of the things. I was in a conference earlier this week hosted by the Circle Canada, Vancouver Foundation, and some other folks, and Beena Patel was talking, and one of the things that she said, and I think I tweeted about it, was about, I don't want your guilt, I want your responsibility. Right, and so that was really powerful for me. So I get triggered when people say sorry. It's one of the things that makes me go a little batshit crazy, particularly when someone says I'm sorry before they've even done something wrong. And so back to what we're saying. It's like I don't want white folks or brown folks or any folks to right to feel. You can feel bad to some degree, and then figure out what to do with that, but then be responsible for the privilege that you have, and then do something with it in service of what other people say you can do for them. Right? It's part of pushing against that savior complex.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good note to end on. So if folks want to learn a little bit more about playing the long game, and Jara getting to go back to her blanket fort. We'll link to her new blog, Musings and Machinations. I never know how to pronounce that word. Do you want to say it once for us?
Musings and Machinations.
There we go. Thank you.
But that's just English. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
You can say it any way you want to.
Right? Language is a tool of the oppressor. So
on that note.
Well, very good. So yeah, we'll link to Jara's blog in the comments for the video, so you can go read more from her. And we just want to thank you very much for joining us here in this piece today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a lovely way to start my day.
Okay. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, all.